The fighting between the Sudan Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces in Sudan continues to rage on in different parts of the country. Al-Fashar, the capital of North Sudan, the only city in Darfur outside of the control of RSF, is currently facing a major assault involving fighting between the two sides and atrocities that are reminiscent of what happened in El Geneina last year and the genocidal violence that happened in Darfur 2 decades ago.
This is Amani Africa Dispatch, our videocast on current political, governance, and peace and security affairs of continental and multilateral policy importance.
The situation continues to deteriorate. There is no indication that either of the two sides would find victory in the current state of affairs. Under these conditions, there are legitimate concerns on the part of Sudanese and the entire region, as well as the international community, that the fighting and the war would push Sudan to some of the worst scenarios that are feared, both by the Sudanese, but also by the region and the international community. Indeed, currently, the humanitarian situation is one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world, but also the fatalities by conservative estimates has crossed 15,000. Situation has become the worst displacement crisis in the world, with IOM reporting the people of Sudan, women and children displaced, either internally or crossing line, have crossed the 10 million mark. And there are several million of Sudanese who are feared to be in the risk of imminent famine. It is under these conditions that the Peace and Security Council of the African Union plans to convene heads of state and government level meeting on Friday. This is a very important meeting for so many reasons. First and foremost, the prospect of the continuation of this war brings a lot of risks with it, both from a humanitarian perspective and from a security perspective. From a security perspective, there is increasing risk of this continuation of the war leading to state collapse or fragmentation in Sudan. And collapse or fragmentation of the kind that we have seen previously in Somalia and Libya. The collapse of Somalia has created a security crisis for a generation and is still unfolding. And that kind of collapse in Sudan would have much more dire and devastating consequence for Sudan and the region for decades to come, much worse than what we have experienced in Somalia. Unlike Somalia, which is surrounded by only 3 countries, Sudan is neighboring a number of countries bordering North Africa, the Sahel and Central Africa regions, as well as the Horn of Africa. And it is also neighbors to countries that are already in political and conflict situations. The implications of state collapse in Sudan would be felt across the breadth and depth of all these regions, and indeed the entire African continent. And whatever happens in Sudan would also create a vacuum that may quickly be filled by terrorist groups. And we may end up having an arc of terrorist networks stretching all the way from West Africa into the Sahel and connecting to the Red Sea. This would be very serious consequence for peace and security, not only for Africa, but also for international peace and security. Whatever is happening in Sudan, a collapsed Sudan, would not remain inland. It would inevitably spill over into the Red Sea, a major maritime commerce route for international trade and commerce. This precarious maritime trade route would be severely affected in the way the state collapse in Somalia had affected the Gulf of Aden, undermining international commerce and trade. If the war is allowed to continue, more atrocities would face vulnerable Sudanese. The threat of famine would expand, and the number of displaced people would increase exponentially, and those seeking refuge into neighboring countries would also increase. Putting Sudan back together after such collapse would be a huge burden for the region and for the international community. If actions are taken now, this could be prevented. This could be avoided. Both state collapse as well as humanitarian catastrophe could be averted in Sudan. And indeed, the challenge facing the Peace and Security Council, as it convenes at head of state and government level on 21 June, would be to contribute and to identify and implement measures critical to facing the twin challenge of the threat of state collapse and humanitarian catastrophe in Sudan. First, in terms of flow of arms and finance that is fueling the war in Sudan. The Peace and Security Council can take specific actions in order to contain and, if possible, switch off this flow of arms, weapons, and finance that is fueling the war in Sudan. One concrete action that it can take towards this end would be to assign a high-level task force headed by a former president who would be tracking, documenting, and reporting the sources and means of the channeling of weapons and finance that is fueling the war in Sudan, with a view to establish mechanisms for switching off, for containing and limiting the flow of arms and finance fueling war in Sudan. Second, and equally importantly, the Peace and Security Council can also find a way of keeping the two warring parties from engaging in active hostilities in certain civilian areas and civilian infrastructures, with a view to protect civilians from the worst consequences of this war and in order to preserve the Sudan from collapse. And this it can therefore do by identifying those parts of Sudan with heavy civilian population to remain outside of active hostilities and to get disengagement of the parties from continuing hostilities in these areas. And to that end, the Peace and Security Council can establish a mechanism for monitoring the establishment of these areas that remain outside of hostilities, and also importantly, those routes that facilitate and ensure unhindered access and delivery of humanitarian assistance to civilians who are caught up in this situation, particularly for averting the imminent famine that is facing several millions of Sudanese. Such a monitoring mechanism, with a presence on the ground in those territories that are free from fighting and should be kept from fighting, could enable the mobilization of food, including from within Sudan, from parts of Sudan that have been producing food to those that are in need, with a view to averting the imminent famine that is facing Sudan. With these measures, the Peace and Security Council can contribute towards addressing the twin challenge of the threat of state collapse and humanitarian catastrophe in Sudan. Additionally, the Peace and Security Council can also take action for the operationalization of the measures that it has already adopted, particularly with its May statement that established and called for investigation into atrocities and proposed plans on the protection of civilians in Sudan. It can set a timeline for receiving this proposed plan on the protection of civilians from the African Union. And through that concrete plan, it can then be able to explore ways and means of enhancing protection of civilians and delivery of humanitarian assistance in Sudan. These measures are critical pending, particularly the effective establishment of a meaningful peace process that has a prospect of success, lead to a ceasefire and ultimately a peace agreement.
This is Amani Africa Dispatch.